From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The economy contracts for the first time in 3 years. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power as President Trump starts his next 100 days with an economic downturn and a new drive to extend the Trump tax cuts. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on the fastest show in politics. Kailey, the president is blaming Joe Biden for the data.
Yeah, he says it's still Joe Biden's economy at this point. Joe Biden's stock market as well, even though earlier in the year, mid-February, when we were at record highs in the S&P 500, he was saying that was because of his election victory. So clearly the spin is active today, as the White House also is saying that the surge in imports shows that countries want to sell to the U.S., not necessarily that its buyers panicked about tariffs.
That's right. You know, they're still going around the cabinet room, a cabinet meeting that began in the last hour. We brought you a good chunk of it here on Bloomberg. Might resolve in some Q&A with the president. If that happens, we'll bring you in the room for it. We did hear from Elon Musk. Got a big round of applause, had nice things to say about the cabinet. A lot of past tense references, though, like he is, in fact, winding things down.
Well, remember, end of May is when reportedly he's going to be shifting his focus back to Tesla. And the president even alluded to that he wants to go home to his cars.
That's right.
Specifically.
And family, I'm sure.
Yeah, and of course, we've heard from many other cabinet officials as well, including, interestingly, from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who talked about IRS revenue being up, an important comment as we consider the X date and how it factors into ongoing reconciliation talks on Capitol Hill.
Big time. As far as that goes, the director of OMB, Russ Vought, saying that things are going well. The president suggesting the same, and it's going to be an interesting slog from here for lawmakers. The Speaker of the House today meeting with SALT Republicans as they try to get on the same page here, Kailey.
And we will be talking about all of that this hour, but we begin on this GDP day with a look at the markets off the lows, but we're still down, and Charlie Pellet is tracking everything for us from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. I got you covered on a very busy day for markets. Also, earnings news coming up after the close of bell. A couple of big ones today. We'll be hearing from Microsoft and Meta Platforms. And ahead of those reports, stocks lower across the board right now, as Kailey said, off-session lows, but the S&P still down 46 right now at 55.14, lower by about 0.8%. Dow Industrials down 190, down 0.5%. NASDAQ is now down 222 points, down 1.3%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 1%. Broad-based selling with the Russell 2000 index down 1.2%. And the Bloomberg Max 7 index ahead of key tech reports, lower now by 2.3%. The 10-year yield, 4.16%, with a 2-year, 3.62%. Gold down $5 the ounce, 33.12, drop there of 0.1%. A big drop for West Texas. Intermediate crude down 3.7%, now with a 58 handle. WTI at 58.14 a barrel. And Bitcoin now down by 0.9%, 94,052 on Bitcoin. Ford CEO says the tariff relief President Trump is extending to automakers is reasonable and the right thing to do, although he indicated that more is needed to fully address the impact of levies. CEO Jim Farley making the comment in an interview on Fox Business. Automakers lower right now, Ford shares down by 2.3%. Again, recapping, stocks selling off, S&P 500 index down now by 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. With a look at the market reaction to today's economic data, the inflation gauge the Fed looks at in terms of the PCE price index, but also, of course, that GDP report that was even weaker than expected thanks to a surge in imports, 0.3% decline in the first quarter. But to hear President Trump describe it, he says that's just the hangover or the overhang from President Joe Biden. He actually said at the beginning of his cabinet meeting that's still ongoing at the White House, Joe, that he deserves a pass when it comes to this data.
Overhang, a technical term for economists, I think, right? We will go back into that cabinet meeting if the president starts to take some questions. Now, enter Peter Navaro, of course, economic advisor and tariff evangelist, speaking to reporters in the White House driveway this morning. This was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. And that's where we have to start with Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. He's with us in New York as we wait to hear from President Trump. Michael, take us to school here. Peter Navaro talked about an extraordinary surge of imports, the world trying to sell to the U.S. Does that front-running of imports guarantee a downturn in the second half of the year? Is there a silver lining here or not?
I wouldn't say there's a silver lining. We don't have any guarantees at all. Matt Miller, our morning anchor here, insulted me today by saying I was sounding like Peter Navaro because I said if I were the president, I would try to turn the attention away from the negative 0.3 headline GDP number and turn it towards the 2.3% gain in real final private sales to domestic buyers, because what you have there is a sign of what we were really spending, businesses and people, consumers. And that's not a terrible number, but it too, like everything else, was influenced by tariffs. We thought we might get through this quarter without a big tariff data impact, but this whole GDP number is shot through with tariff implications. And so much of it is the effort by companies, especially, to get ahead of tariffs and order things early. We saw this huge jump in imports that probably, I think they said the biggest ever. And then that fed into inventories, and the business spending was up 9.8%, but a lot of that was because they were ordering all this stuff. So it's really hard to say that this is a great report or the best one you've ever seen, but there are political ways maybe to spin it a little better.
Well, and when we're considering the data we still have yet to get this week, Mike, with a payrolls report coming up on Friday for the month of April, and I wonder whether or not we're still counting April as being Biden's economy or Trump's economy now that he's in his second 100 days in office as we speak. How will all of that data collectively factor into a Federal Reserve decision that's coming next week?
It won't. There's no... Today, basically, because the GDP numbers showed a contraction in growth overall and a rise in the quarterly PCE numbers, somebody said this morning, well, this makes the Fed's job harder. And I said, no, it makes it easier because it just reinforces the idea that they don't want to do anything right now. You've got contradictory numbers or contradictory directions on the Fed's two mandates in that GDP report. And we don't know what's going to go on from here because remember, this quarter ended in March. And in March, we had the aluminum and steel tariffs, but little else other than the standard Chinese stuff. And so we don't know what the impact is going to be of all the tariffs that got put on, got taken off, et cetera, during the month of April. It certainly has affected consumers' thinking, but has it affected their actions? And that's the question ahead. So we're going to have to be watching all this data very carefully, and the Fed's just going to sit back and do that. You mentioned the jobs report. Tomorrow, we get the ISM manufacturing report. And while that is considered soft data, it could be very important to the markets because if we see the same kind of nationwide response that we've seen in some of the regional numbers, we're going to see a big drop in manufacturing activity, new orders, that sort of thing. And that's also not going to play well with Wall Street.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. Thank you so much, breaking down the data we have in hand and the data still to come. Thank you very much indeed. As we're still keeping an eye on the cabinet room at the White House, we're hearing right now from the Interior Secretary Doug Burgum. The only remaining cabinet secretary left to speak as they go all the way around the table is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And again, when it gets back to President Trump, if he decides to take questions from reporters, we will be bringing that to you. But first, we want to get more insight on where the economy is right now and whether or not the president deserves credit or blame for that, and turn to Douglaz Holtz-Eakin. He's president of the American Action Forum and former director of the Congressional Budget Office. There's a lot Congress-wise we want to talk to you about, Douglaz, but if we could first begin with the deterioration we've seen in GDP, the suggestion from the president that it's Joe Biden who shoulders the blame for this. Does that excuse work today? And if it does, how much longer will it?
Well, if it works today, it's not going to work beginning tomorrow. I'd say this is really the end of the period when you could point backwards on the data. The president can't be responsible for the January data, but the quarter as a whole, it really is in the Trump administration. It's a noticeable weakening in the economy. I think if you toss out all the trade-related factors that Mike McKee went through, you've got an underlying growth rate of something like 1.5, down from 2.5 in the fourth quarter, 2.4. That's troubling because it's when we turn the corner into April that we see the impact of Liberation Day and the array of tariffs that went on and off. We'll get our first impact read on that in the official data on Friday, but we saw the ADP employment report today, and that came in very soft, 62,000 jobs. Some weakness in places you wouldn't expect, education and health. So I think Friday's jobs report is going to be a very important read on the economy.
It'll tell us a lot more as we hear further references to the R word here and some suggesting we may already be in a recession. Douglaz, it's great to have you back. We heard from Peter Navaro this morning, as you might have heard me mention. This was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. You feel that way too?
Well, every now and then I yell at the TV. No, I don't feel that way at all. This was a bad report. I don't think there's any way you can sugarcoat it. Among the things that were really troubling was the very soft household spending, particularly on goods, durable goods. You would have thought that people, and we heard a lot of anecdotes about this, you would have thought that people would be buying ahead of the tariffs to get those things in their houses before they hit. That's a really weak number. And so I think if you look at that and the fact that outside of what's clearly a tariff-related surge in equipment investment, the core of the economy really didn't look good in the first quarter. And as Mike McKee mentioned, the PCE core price index was up to 3.5%. That's a bad combination. Rising inflation, softening economy. Nobody should think this is a good print.
Well, so then it becomes a question of any kind of correction or what could pull us out from the downward trajectory, Douglaz. And the White House would argue, as we heard evidenced in the cabinet meeting earlier, that the tax cuts coming down the pike, the renewal of the 2017 cuts, the others that Trump would like to implement, are going to be somewhat of a solve here. And I wonder, assuming that the president can get everything he wants on tax policy, which still remains a question as Congress works on that, to what extent you do expect it'll be some kind of offsetting factor?
Well, let's think about what's in the bill. I mean, number one, it's an extension of current tax law. I don't think anyone expects it to sunset, so we're not going to get any juice out of that. That's just more of the same. There are the business expenses on R&D and equipment investment, interest deductibility. Those are modestly positive, but I don't think they're earth-shaking. And then there are the array of campaign promises: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, SALT cap, things that the president wants to have at least some modest bow toward to fulfill his campaign promises. Those aren't earth changers either. So, from an economic point of view, the tax bill is not a big boost to growth. I mean, it's something we got in 2017. It's already in the economy. So I think the real issue here is, does the president come to reality on what he's done with the tariff policy? If you think having a sunset and a $425 billion tax increase next year is a bad idea, that's what he did on Liberation Day. And so I think some rethinking of the burden that he has placed on American businesses and consumers is really in order. And it's hitting the small businesses the hardest. They're the ones who are cash constrained. They're the ones who are going to pull back on their CapEx the quickest. And I'm concerned about that outlook.
Yeah, interesting. We could talk about the baseline until we're blue in the face here, Douglaz, but are we talking about likely an enormous deficit spend here? We're looking at the potential for Medicaid cuts one day, and Donald Trump last night says, and by the way, he's been consistent on don't touch Medicaid. Yeah. It's been a different conversation on the Hill. Last night he said Republicans will increase Medicaid spending. How are we going to pay for that?
I don't think there's a plan to pay for it. They don't plan to pay for defense spending increases. They don't plan to pay for border spending increases. So I think the best case scenario one could map out would be one where we didn't make the current already bad fiscal outlook worse, but most likely it will be worse. Maybe not dramatically worse, but certainly worse than they inherited. And that means that beginning next year, which is an election year, not much will happen. We have to at some point get serious about the deficit. And there's no seriousness right now, and I don't think anything in this bill is going to address it at all.
Well, and when we consider the deficit, that's why we keep having to borrow and borrow and borrow, and the Treasury's debt ceiling of how much it can issue goes higher and higher. We heard from the Treasury Secretary that IRS revenue has been up, Douglaz, as we await an update from the Treasury on when exactly the X date will be. When are you anticipating it, and how important will that be to the movement of legislation in Congress if it's earlier in the summer than is previously or is currently anticipated?
We've mentioned this before when I was on, and I'm quite worried about the fact that they're counting on the reconciliation bill to raise the debt limit. There's no guarantee those timetables line up. It's going to be hard to get to yes in the House, hard to get to yes in the Senate, and even harder to get the two houses to agree on a single piece of legislation. That might not happen before an August X date, in which case they'll have to break out and do the debt limit by itself. We saw the bond market react on in the week after Liberation Day. We saw the long end of the yield curve go up, and this is not the time to have some sort of misstep in raising the debt limit. They need to do it in a timely fashion, not scare international capital markets, secure the funding future of the Treasury, and that may not be able to happen on the timetable of reconciliation. So there should be a plan B out there somewhere.
Plan B out there. You must get that tinge. Your antennas go up when the X date is approaching here, Douglaz. If that has to be handled separately and Republicans make a deal with Democrats, putting your politics hat on for a moment, does that change the nuances of the reconciliation debate, or are these going to be two completely separate exercises? One will involve Democrats, the other will not.
If they have to do the debt limit, they will need Democrats in both the House and the Senate, and that will be expensive. Democrats will want some things that Republicans aren't planning to do in reconciliation. They're going to want an extension of the health insurance tax credits. They're going to want a bigger child credit. They're going to want a lot. And so what loses is the fiscal outlook. You get to raise the debt limit and solve the immediate problem, but you make the longer-term problem harder. And I don't know what that does in reconciliation. It may empower them to say, okay, well, we might as well just blow it all out this year. We already spent a lot of money, which is the wrong reaction to have, but we've seen it before. So I think that dynamic's actually a very dangerous one from a fiscal policy point of view.
Well, and when we consider the shape of all of this policy, what role realistically, Douglaz, is the parliamentarian going to play? And is there anything you're skeptical about actually getting through that review, knowing that for Republicans to be able to pull this off, they have to use this reconciliation process? And John Thune wants to stick to, or at least was indicating previously, wants to stick to whatever the parliamentarian rules.
Right. Yes, he did say that, and I think that's the right call. It really limits the scope. I mean, we've heard things like putting all of the competition policy in the Department of Justice and getting rid of the FTC. You can't do that in reconciliation. There's a lot of regulatory reform they'd like to do. It seems unlikely to make it through in regulation. Energy policy, you can do clean energy tax credits in or out, but you can't really do big policy making. So I think it would narrow the scope of that one big beautiful bill considerably. And if they want to make those policies real, they're going to have to do some more legislating after the reconciliation bill.
Where are you on the timelines here, Douglaz? The Speaker still seems to think Memorial Day is realistic. Scott Besson is pointing us to the 4th of July. Are either reasonable?
I've been thinking Thanksgiving all along, so I'm skeptical. I mean, my observation is that the House can be done by July 4th, and the Senate can be done by July 4th, but I don't think they can agree by July 4th. They have yet to settle any differences. Wow. As you mentioned at the outset, they haven't even figured out which baseline to use. We got a current policy baseline in the Senate, a current law baseline in the House. They were discussing that in December. At some point, someone has to force decisions to be made. That should be the president, in my view, but they haven't. And so they've let this process drift along on two separate tracks for all practical purposes.
Well, and when we consider practicality here, Douglaz, we heard the president last night at his rally in Michigan talking about Republicans in Congress, actually, that may need to be voted out because of the way in which they sometimes act against the rest of the party. I think we know the types he's referring to. I'm not sure if Tom Massey and Chip Roy's ears. perked up at that. But I do wonder what you expect to see from some of these hardline conservatives who want deep spending cuts, who want to see these offsets and may not be able to see them in the kind of size and scale realistically that they'd hope.
You know, a reconciliation bill is an act of disappointment for everybody. It's not going to have anyone's desired mix. You're always compromising. You're always trying to fit it into the box that you've created from the budgetary point of view. And the reality is failure is not an option. So in the end, after all of the posturing and the speeches, which will take us to Thanksgiving in my view, they're going to, you know, lock arms and vote yes. And I think that's the outcome that everyone should expect.
Mm-hmm. Spending time with Douglas Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum as we also keep an eye on the White House here. President Trump is holding an extended cabinet meeting here, opening up his next 100 days at the White House, and they've been going around the room. If he takes some questions from reporters, we'll put an ear on what he's saying. Douglas, the next 100 days will be occupied more by Trump tax cuts or tariff talk, because I do feel like we're getting a bit of a transition here in the language that we're hearing from the president.
Well, I think that he's going to try to point to the tax bill as the sort of economic rescue plan.
Yeah.
This week report. I just don't think the substance is as outstanding as the rhetoric is. I mean, to not do it is a disaster. So let's be clear, they have to do the extension, but it's not going to do much beyond, as I said, current policy, so it's not going to do much for the economy. So I think the right thing is to, get it done in as quick a fashion as possible, and that would require, I think, a little more leadership out of the White House. Also, feature the deregulation, which all the pieces are in place to do a lot of deregulation as he did in his first time in office, and so I would feature that, and I would negotiate however many faux trade deals you need to get rid of the reciprocal tariffs. That's just too much and dangerous. And then start thinking hard about what to do with the 10% universal tariff. That to me is the one he has a hard time walking away from. It's his idea. Yeah. He's not going to admit he made a mistake. There's no one to negotiate with. And so, there may be a need for Congress to rescue him from himself and have them take away the authority to do that. I just think if the economy really weakens in the second quarter, you're going to see Congress start to think real hard about doing that.
All right. Douglas, it's always great to spend some time with you. Douglas Holtz-Eakin with his view from the American Action Forum. He's the former director of the CBO and knows what he speaks. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey. Leinz. We're going to bring you back to the White House right now. President Trump just now resolving this cabinet meeting to take some questions from reporters. This is live on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And you know who else I'll never tell? A judge. Because the conduct of our foreign policy belongs to the President of the United States and the executive branch, not some judge. So we will conduct foreign policy appropriately if we need to, but I'll never discuss it. And no one will ever make us discuss it, because that's how foreign policy works.
Mr. President, yesterday you told ABC News, Mr. President, you told ABC News yesterday that you could get Abrego Garcia back if you wanted to. Do you think President Bukele would turn you down if you made that request?
I really don't know. I know that he's been a great friend of our country. He's gotten a lot less money than this would take from us if we were going to build these jails and do what he's doing. And they run a very professional operation. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him. I really leave that to the lawyers, and I take my advice from Pam and everybody that is very much involved. They know the laws, and we follow the laws exactly.
Mr. President, yeah, the transition, sir. You frequently took credit for the stock market highs. You said it was a reflection of how well you were doing in the polls, and then after you were elected, you said the stock market highs were a reflection of how well the transition's going and the American people's confidence in your incoming administration. Now, the stock market's not doing so well, and you're saying that's the Biden stock market, yet you are the president. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I'm not taking credit or discredit for the stock market. I'm just saying that we inherited a mess, both at the borders. You could look at every single one of the people here, and no matter who it is, they're doing better, and they are far superior to what took place for 4 years before us. When you look at prisoners being allowed to come into our country at will, just at will, people from mental institutions, gang members, drug dealers, when you look at that, what they've done to our country, and also having to do with finance. Look at what happened with inflation. We had the worst inflation probably in the history of our country. They say 48 years, but I would say in the history of our country, it ate away at people. And even though you saw a stock market going up somewhat, because in my case, I had the biggest stock market increase, 88% in the last term, in my last term. But I don't view the stock market as the end all. It's an indicator. But what the stock market really tells you, and when you look at the stock market in this case, is it says how bad a situation we inherited. This was a quarter that we looked at today, and we took all of us together. We came in on January 20th. So this is Biden, and you could even say the next quarter is sort of Biden, because it doesn't just happen on a daily or an hourly basis. But we're turning it around. It's a big ship to turn around, and we're going to have the greatest country financially in the history of the world, I believe. I think we're going to do things and we had to do it. We reset the table. We were being ripped off by every single country, with just about without exception. I'd have to really think hard for who hasn't taken advantage. And I don't even blame those countries. I blame the person that was sitting right here where I am for allowing it to happen, where our country was ripped off on trade, hundreds of billions of dollars. And now we're doing better than we've done in a long time. You know, we were losing $4 to $5 to even $6 billion a day on trade with Biden. And now we have it down to a very manageable number, and the tariffs, for the most part, haven't even kicked in yet. So that's the way. Stock markets, to me, are an indication, but the big indication is what's happening, and the people around the table know what's happening. Yes.
The Ukraine minerals deal is set to be signed in 24 hours or so. Is it true that the Ukraine minerals deal is about to be signed in the next 24 hours or so? There's some reports saying that. And if it's true, has the deal changed at all from the last time we heard about it?
Well, I'll ask Scott to answer the question because he's responsible for it.
Yeah, our side's ready to sign. The Ukrainians decided last night to make some last-minute changes. We're sure that they will reconsider that, and we are ready to sign this afternoon if they are.
Can you talk about those last-minute changes? What was removed or put in its place?
Nothing's been removed. It's the same agreement that we agreed to on the weekend. No changes on our side.
Just to put that in perspective, though, when I came here, I said, how much money have we given to Ukraine? The real number is about $350 billion. It's unthinkable. And we had no security. We had no nothing. We were just pouring money there, unsecured money, putting it in banks, and anybody could have taken it out. You know, anybody over there, it was their decision. I've never seen anything like it. Europe, on the other hand, which is obviously that whole situation is much more important to Europe because we have an ocean in between. But Europe gave about $100 billion. It's a lot of money. It's a big sacrifice they made also. But they gave much less than we did. And their money is secured, totally secured, by deposits in banks. The deposits are largely Russian deposits. That's what Europe did, but their money is secured. So they gave $100 billion totally secured. We gave money like it's throwing it out the window. And it was done by Biden, and this is Biden's war. This isn't Trump's war. I'm trying to get out. And more than the money, they're losing about 5,000 young Russian and Ukrainian soldiers a week, mostly. There's some people also being killed in towns where missiles should not have been shot, small cities and towns. But we are trying to save the lives of about 5,000 young, mostly soldiers, that are losing their lives a week. I see satellite photos, probably off one of his satellites, come to think of it. But I see satellite photos every week of fields with arms and heads and legs scattered all over. It's a violent, violent, horrible situation. And more important than the money, I want to save the lives of people from other countries that are dying so stupidly, so needlessly, and they're dying. But I said, what are we doing? How did we get into this war? It would have never happened if I were president. Everybody knows, and it didn't happen for 4 years. Wasn't even thought of. I discussed it with President Putin a lot. Ukraine was the apple of his eye, but there was no way he was going to do anything. Zero chance. And I said, you know, we feel foolish. The Europeans are putting up money. It's totally secure. They get the money back. We're putting up much more money, We have absolutely nothing. And I didn't want to make a complicated deal. I didn't want to make a deal that couldn't be made because Ukraine doesn't have very much money. They're going through a very bad period of time. It's been brutal. But I felt very foolish being a judge. So I said, well, we want something for our efforts beyond what you would think would be acceptable. And we said rare earth. They have very good rare earth. As you know, we're looking for rare earth all the time. Rare earth is called rare for a reason. And they have a lot. And we made a deal where our money is secure, where we can start digging and doing what we have to do. It's also good for them because you'll have an American presence at the site, Chris. And the American presence will, I think, keep a lot of bad actors out of the country, or certainly out of the area where we're doing the digging. So we made a deal, and I assume they're going to honor the deal. And I put Scott in charge, and Scott's done it beautifully, but we haven't really seen the fruits of that deal yet. I suspect we will. I suspect we will.
Mr. President, progress. You had set a 90-day deadline through an executive order for Secretaries Hegseth and Noem to review whether to recommend to you whether to invoke the Insurrection Act to send troops to the southern border. Is that something you're still considering?
Well, I'm talking to them, and it's not hard and fast, but I'm talking to them, and I will tell you that the border is the most secure it's ever been. We have never had anything like it. And when you said, Christy, before, it's 99.999, and I guess that means one person maybe, or two people. It's actually turned out to be 3 people came across the border versus hundreds of thousands of people under Biden. And we're talking about people coming. Look, people, they have souls, they have hearts. Many of them are good, but we have a country that's under siege. We have a country that really is I think it's under attack. In many ways, worse than under attack, because there are no uniforms. You don't know who the attacker is, so you really don't. It's not like you're fighting an army. You're fighting people. You don't even know who they are. But 11,888 murderers, many of them murdered far more than one person, are roaming. Now, some of them have already been caught. A lot of them have already been caught and taken out. But we're being impeded by judges from doing our job. And hopefully that situation is going to be solved, because I think nobody wants to have murderers and people from jail, and I mean for serious, serious crime. I remember the Biden people used to say, no, these are aliens that came into our country and they don't commit crime. I said, they don't commit crime, they commit worse crime. They make our criminals. Some of these people that they've allowed in through open border policies, the dumbest thing I've ever seen. You can look at some of these people and you say, this is not going to end well. But the people that they've allowed into our country are making our criminals look like the nicest people on earth. I will tell you, these are serious criminals. These are violent criminals. These are people that would kill you and wouldn't lose an ounce of sleep, and they wake up the next morning and they don't even remember it. This is a rough, tough group of people, and we've got to get them out of our country. And the law says, I believe, I hope, and I think Pam will be very successful in proving it, but we've run into, I would call them rogue judges. Somebody could criticize me for that. These are rogue judges. These are radical left, generally radical left, horrible judges. And we didn't lose all of these people. You know, we've lost a lot of people to death and to rape, all sorts of crimes committed by the people that poured into our country. And they came in totally unimpeded. Just come on in. And you see it every night. You'd see thousands and tens of thousands of people pouring into our country. We have no idea who they are. And to this day, we're looking for people. We have no idea. We hear that we have terrorists in our country that are so bad, they couldn't stay in any other country, but we're getting them out. And the group between Pete and Christy and Tom Holman and everybody working together, people that you would least suspect are reporting them, getting, and the public is reporting them. The public is seeing. The public is calling and they're saying, you know, I live in a house and next to me moved in a group of people and they are very violent. and would go and would find out and would say, yeah, you're right, they were really violent, and we have information on most of them. So I just think it's incredible what's taken place. But we right now have a very, very secure border. Right now we have the most secure border in the history of our country, so I don't think we have to worry about your question too much.
Mr. President, as Prime Minister of Canada ran against, not only against the Conservatives, but also against you. Yesterday, yesterday he spoke about American betrayal. Are you interested in rebuilding relations with Canada, and if so, how?
No, well, I think we're going to have a great relationship. He called me up yesterday. He said, "Let's make a deal." You know, he was running for office. They both hated Trump, and it was the one that hated Trump, I think, the least that won. I actually think the conservative hated me much more than the so-called liberal. He's a pretty liberal guy. But no, I spoke to him yesterday. Couldn't have been nicer, and I congratulated him. You know, it was a very mixed signal because it's almost even, which makes it very complicated for the country. It's a pretty tight race, but he's a very nice gentleman, and he's going to come to the White House very shortly, within the next week or less.
Mr. President, when will you speak to President Xi of China?
That'll happen. I mean, look, right now, and I told you before, they're having tremendous difficulty because their factories are not doing business. They made $1 trillion with Biden, $1 trillion, even $1.1 trillion with Biden selling us stuff. Much of it we don't need. You know, somebody said, "Oh, the shelves are going to be open." Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30. You know, and maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally. But we're not talking about something that we have to go out of our way. They have ships that are loaded up with stuff, much of which, not all of it, but much of which we don't need. And we have to make a fair deal. We've been ripped off by every country in the world, but China, I would say, is the leading one, the leading candidate for the chief ripper offer. There has never been a country that's been ripped off more than the United States of America under some of the dumbest leadership, and it usually starts with the president. And you can go back, and I'm not just talking about Biden. It's been the worst. I mean, the trade deficits and everything else, he's been the worst. But he had no idea what he was doing, and I think somebody ought to look at the auto pen to find out who was really running this country, because it wasn't Biden. Because nobody could agree to what he agreed to. I mean, he put our country at risk, at tremendous risk. And fiscal risk, financial risk. So I think we have it very much. I really believe that the next 100 days is going to be even better than this. Look, I read an editorial yesterday from a group that normally wouldn't write a good, that this is the most consequential presidency in history, in the history of our country. This is not a particular group that would write that kind of an editorial, but they see what we're doing and what we had to do. And I believe if this group, not just me, if this group wasn't here, I think our country was going to be in, if it was lucky, just serious trouble, but a lot worse than that. I think our country could have been a total disaster. Bad things were happening with our country, and we've stemmed the tide, we've turned it around, but we're going to really turn it around over the next 3 years, 3.5 years, we're going to turn it around, and then hopefully it'll be in such great shape. That's my goal, to put it in such great condition that it can't be destroyed.
Do you
You mentioned this last night in your speech in Macomb, but we're facing an unprecedented situation where there's a lot of abuses of nationwide injunctions, sort of seemingly designed to curtail your power, specifically when it comes to deporting these illegal, violent aliens that came in under the previous administration. Yeah. Have you spoken to your team about ways to mitigate this and continue to deliver for the American people on that aspect?
There are ways to mitigate it, and there's some very strong ways. There's one way that's been used by 3 very highly respected presidents, but we hope we don't have to go that route. But there is one way that has been used very successfully by 3 presidents, all highly respected. and hopefully we don't have to go that way. But there are ways of mitigating that. I want to thank you all very much. I thought this was an incredible cabinet meeting. I think there's probably has never been a cabinet meeting like this, and you've never seen it on tape, that I can tell you. And I want to just congratulate everybody at the table, but we have a lot of work to do, but we're off to a great start. Thank you very much, everybody.
Do you enjoy, Mr. President, taking the White House back second time?
Thank you,
How's your life?
Thank you, everybody.
I'm working hard. I like my life. I'm working hard, but I like it because we're doing a lot of good for a lot of people. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
All right, that was about 2 hours in length. President Trump convening a meeting of his cabinet at the White House, seen and heard live here on Bloomberg TV and radio, as he discussed a number of different matters with reporters, specifically on China. When he was asked whether or not he's speaking to Xi, he said it will happen, suggesting perhaps that it hasn't happened yet, noting that China, in his words, is the leading candidate for chief ripper-offer of the United States, even going as far as to suggesting that children may have fewer dolls because of where tariffs are with China at this point. Also interesting to hear the president characterizing his reaction to today's weak GDP data, which initially, at least on True Social, he said was Joe Biden's to blame. He reiterated as much in this cabinet meeting today. He says that he's not taking credit or discredit for what's happening in the stock market, specifically that he thinks it's just a mere indication, shows how bad of a situation we inherited, to use his words. But then went as far as to say, Joe, that next quarter, not just the quarter we just experienced, will also show Joe Biden, even though he'll be literally months into his presidency.
We talked to Douglas Holtz-Eakin a little while ago, who said, no, this is Trump data. This is the first quarter. And we also know that Joe Biden finished his term with, I believe it was 2.4% growth. So we've seen a real reversal here. Well, we heard from all the cabinet officials, as well as Vice President J.D. Vance earlier, telling reporters about the stories that they should be covering. This administration kind of scolded the media in the room there and referred to most of the presidents in the past as placeholders. It was an interesting conversation as this White House opens the next 100 days, Kailey.
Yeah, and of course, geopolitics factored in, too, after reporting from Bloomberg earlier today that the mineral deal with Ukraine was on the cusp of being signed. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, said that the U.S. is ready to sign, could be ready to sign this afternoon, but said last night Ukraine decided to make last-minute changes, that there's been no changes on the U.S. side, but that seems to be perhaps where a hiccup is now. And President Trump, when weighing in on that deal, talked about the importance of having rare earths because they are rare, to use his words, and said that the American presence on the site would be a factor.
Says they call them rare for a reason.
Yeah.
That was an interesting moment with Scott Bessent. He did say that no changes have been made, but he also did not quantify the changes that Ukraine is asking for. And this feels really familiar when it comes to this minerals deal. They just can't seem to come to terms.
Yeah, we're going to get into this with our colleague Dan Flatley in just a moment here, as he covers both Treasury and national security issues for us at Bloomberg. But first, we want to check on these GDP day markets, and Charlie Pellet is tracking them from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. Indeed, the economic data very much playing into today's move lower for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. Right to the numbers here. We're well off session lows, but still looking at a 36-point drop on the S&P 500 index, down 0.6%. Dow Jones Industrial Average now down 131 points. The Dow lower by 0.3%. A 1% drop now for the NASDAQ Composite Index. The NASDAQ 100 Index down 0.8%. Broad-based selling with the Russell 2000 Index down by 1%. And the Bloomberg Mag 7 Index ahead of earnings after the bell from Meta and Microsoft. That index right now lower by 2%. Your 10-year 4.16%. The 2-year 3.61%. Gold now down 0.2%. 33.10 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude is slumping 3.2%. WTI 58.48 a barrel, and Bitcoin now down 0.7%, 94,163. Briefly, the U.S. economy contracted at the start of the year. Traders do expect the Fed to cut rates to forestall a recession. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. Joining us from New York as we're experiencing a busy day here in Washington, having just wrapped a cabinet meeting at the White House that lasted roughly 2 hours, with more expected, as President Trump will be making remarks on investing in America later this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. What we don't know whether or not will be happening this afternoon, though, is a signing of the minerals deal that has been in the works for months now, negotiating between the U.S. and Ukraine. We just heard from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, in that cabinet meeting, suggesting that on the U.S. side, they'd be ready to sign as soon as this afternoon, that the U.S. has made no changes, but that Ukraine, Joe, decided to make some last-minute tweaks as of last night.
Yeah, this is feeling a bit familiar. We all remember when Scott Bessent traveled all the way to Kyiv to sign this same deal, and he came home empty-handed. That set us up for the meltdown in the Oval Office in a meeting with President Zelensky that did not go well. So we thought we were coming back around on this, and it may not be about to happen. Dan Flatley is with us right now at the table, Bloomberg's Treasury reporter, who spent a lot of time in the national security space. Dan, and we saw the convergence of these two in the cabinet meeting with regard to the minerals deal, which was said to potentially unlock a peace deal in Ukraine. This is feeling familiar. Will this ever be signed?
Yeah, Joe, it's a great question, and what a saga this has been.
Yeah.
But, I think just to take one step back, this deal is very important for Ukraine. This basically, the deal itself, we could talk about the details. We're still getting some reporting on that. But essentially what this is a guarantee, as far as the Trump administration is concerned, that the U.S. will continue to remain involved in Ukraine, will help Ukraine achieve some sort of equitable peace deal with Russia, if that's even possible at this point. But this deal is key. And the stakes are very high for Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with this deal, because you mentioned his trip to Kyiv earlier this year. That was a pivotal moment for him as the Treasury Secretary. It was something that was a little bit different outside of the normal role of a Treasury Secretary, trying to execute this deal that has huge national security implications, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen at that table with Zelensky, and so here we are today, and it has to happen. It has to happen. Both parties are interested in this deal happening. The Ukrainians are interested in it for all the reasons we just talked about. The U.S. is interested in it, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is interested in it because he's put a lot on the line for this personally. So I think that they will get to sign it at the end of the day, but from all we understand from our reporting, it's looking a little dicey at the moment.
Well, and if Ukraine is interested, if this is actually vital to their interests to sign this deal, they don't seem overly eager to rush to the table to actually use the pen. Dan, what is the holdup for Ukraine? Do we have an understanding of what changes it is they're seeking?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple of things going on here. Part of it is a clash of negotiating styles. The U.S. has really come on strong with this deal. And part of that is political, and it has to do with, the support for Ukraine among Trump's base and how all that's playing out. And the Ukrainians have a vested interest in this. The stakes are very high for them, but maybe higher than for anyone else, really, in getting this done. And so they're pushing. They want to get this done, but I think they have some concerns about some of the technical details. And this is a big deal for them, and it's something that Zelensky and his advisors have to sell back home. So they don't want to appear to be giving away their own natural resources, their own sovereign wealth, their own prerogatives to a foreign country, no matter how great an ally it might be or how powerful it is or whatever. So I think that there's a little bit of his negotiating styles. Some of it is just the stakes are so high. But I think the fact that we're here today talking about this is, I don't think anybody would have predicted we would be here a month and a half ago or whenever the Oval Office blow up was. So.
Well, that's a very good point. That also speaks to this idea that even if getting this agreement done is hard, there's also the wider peace agreement the U.S. still wants to see between between Russia and Ukraine, and that is a whole other can of worms we'll have to get into another time. Dan Flatley, who covers the Treasury for us here at Bloomberg, thank you so much for your reporting. As we mentioned, we heard from the Treasury Secretary in the cabinet meeting earlier today, but heard much more from the president himself, Donald Trump, especially in the aftermath of today's weak GDP reading, a decline of 0.3%, thanks in part to a surge in imports as companies tried to front-run the tariffs. And he says it's not him to blame. It's his predecessor, Joe Biden.
That's right. Biden data, Biden markets as well. And the president was actually asked about the stock market today, and he's been kind of changing his thought on this, suggesting he's more concerned about Main Street than Wall Street. It's a very different look than we had in the first Trump administration. He was also asked about empty shelves, Kailey. really interesting moment. You're going to hear this played back. This is the way this goes. And that's sometimes why a 2-hour freewheeling ad-libbed interaction with the media can come with some risk. He said maybe the children will have 20 dolls instead of 30 dolls. They have ships loaded up with stuff, much of it we don't need. Put a pin in that for now.
Yeah, as we consider what other shelves other than toys may find themselves emptied if indeed we still have effectively a cutoff of trade between the U.S. and China. So we want to get into all of this now and turn to Betsy Stevenson. She's professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan, also a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration, former chief economist at the Department of Labor as well. Betsy, if we could begin first with the president's characterization today of this data, which is indeed backward looking at the first quarter, is more reflective of Joe Biden's presidency than his, even suggesting that the next quarter may be more reflective of Biden than Trump as well. Is there any way in which that is factually accurate?
No. I mean, what's ridiculous is President Trump tried to take credit for the economy around the time he was elected, that the economy was improving because people are anticipating him. And now he's saying that now that he's actually been president, that it's Biden. Like, we all know what's going on in this data. There's just been a lot of people are just not sure what President Trump's going to do. So let's put aside whether tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea. Nobody actually even really knows what's going to happen. And that is meant that, there's just been a huge run up in inventories, because if you're not sure what's going to happen, one way to get around that is to just make your purchases now, stock up inventories, and then at least you can give yourself some certainty about what your business will look like for the next 3 or 4 months. And so we saw a lot of businesses really go down that path in this quarter, which actually makes this data particularly hard to interpret in terms of where we'll be next quarter. But one thing we can know for sure is this is President Trump's economy.
Well, you probably heard us discussing, Betsy, and maybe you heard Peter Navaro or President Trump talking about the benefits of an import surge. Peter Navaro called it extraordinary and said this was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. What will be the fallout of that extraordinary import surge later in the year?
I don't actually know what they mean by that. It seems kind of ironic to me, because I thought the whole idea was to get us to reduce our imports. And there's so much anxiety that we might have to reduce imports that it caused us all to increase our imports. So it will be pretty funny if at the end of 2025, it turns out we've imported more things under President Trump's first year than we had under President Biden's last year. But aside from that, I think there's a lot of confusion when people look at the GDP numbers, because they say, well, the problem is negative because of, we subtract the imports. But remember, we're also adding the imports. So the reason we're subtracting them is we add up all the money that companies spend, and that includes the money they're spending on imports. But because we're not making those in the United States, this is a fair complaint that I think President Trump would agree with. We don't want to count those as part of our economy, because we only want to count the stuff that we're making, we're producing, our goods and services. So we subtract from their spending what they spent on imports. Now, if you want to get a little wonky, it's quite possible that there are some measurement issues, which means we're better at counting the imports that we're subtracting off than counting up all the purchases. And so when we get a revision, it might not be quite as negative, because we might be adding more in on the purchases side than we're subtracting off on the import side. But I think some of this is also what companies are doing is they're prioritizing their spending on imports, which means not spending on stuff we're producing domestically. So there is a trade-off. Every dollar you spend on something is a dollar you're not spending on something else. And if you're terrified that imports aren't going to be available to you, so you're spending all your money on that, what aren't you buying?
Well, yeah. Would that include, say, adding salaries, hiring people, Betsy? How quickly could this bleed into the labor market as we look ahead to a jobs report on Friday?
Absolutely, right? If you're out there buying equipment because you're thinking, if I don't get ahead on this equipment, that's going to be a priority to you over, say, replacing a worker who's left, or making sure you keep a worker by giving them a raise. So you can absolutely think that this has a direct impact on the domestic workforce. Look, the thing we don't know is we don't know what's going to happen with tariffs. So we don't know what these businesses are going to do in the second quarter. Are they going to keep trying? You know, it's sort of, I think we're done trying to accumulate imports, you know, internationally now, right? So now we got to live off our inventories. How quickly do we spend them down? When do they get to go back to importing things at an affordable price? And that'll affect what ends up happening to workers and whether they need to let people go. I think a lot of companies struggled to hire coming out of the pandemic. So we're going to see companies being quite slow to let people go, but they will also be slow to fill empty slots. So that's the path we're currently on. And the question will be whether they get desperate enough that they have to let people go. I'm going to tell you that the warning that President Trump is giving us that we're going to have fewer stuff on our shelves, that's not a good one.
It's not a good one, but it is one that we're going to remember, Betsy. It's great to have you back. Betsy Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz as we drive our way through this Wednesday in the nation's capital. We've heard a lot, Kailey, from Donald Trump, a 2-hour affair with the cabinet today. This follows a 90-minute speech last night, the rally in Michigan, and he's not done speaking. There's going to be an investment event, 4 p.m. Eastern time, that we'll have eyes and ears on as we approach the late edition of Balance of Power.
Yeah, we're expecting the president's going to be touting investment companies are making in the U.S., something we heard a little bit about in the cabinet meeting as he specifically shouted out TSMC, even though those investments in Arizona actually started under Biden, used money from the CHIPS Act. So we always have to put things in context here, and we'll continue to do that later on in the late edition of Balance of Power. That's coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week Daily is straight ahead right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Apple or Spotify, wherever else you get your podcast. Subscribe. Hear our full conversation with Betsy Stevenson and listen anytime at the website, Bloomberg.com.